story so far. Whilst on a night trip with the hidden people, Tim and Simon, who were invisible at the time, chanced upon Kevin and his brother Jim acting suspiciously. The next day, they found out that Mr. Berryman's house had been burgled and his mother's silver spoons stolen. Just to make things worse, Simon had dropped his glove the previous evening in the yard, and the police found it outside Mr. Berryman's back window. Now they think that Tim and Simon are the thieves. Tim visited Melinda to seek help from the hidden people and was given a potion of invisibility to help prove his innocence. Tim told Simon about his visit to Melinda on the way to school the next morning. "You let me come with you, won't you?" said Simon. "We'll go looking for Jim and Kevin. We can make ourselves invisible and go anywhere." "I think we'd better let Tobias and Sebastian find out where they're staying first," said Tim. "Then I can go into the house and get the spoons." "But I'll come too." "I don't think you should," said Tim. "It won't be easy even for one. The more of us there are about, the easier it will be to get into trouble." "But I want to be invisible," said Simon. "I tell you what," said Tim. "I think I'll have to be the one to get the spoons. But when it's all over, we'll use a drop or two of Melinda's mixture and make ourselves invisible for an hour, just for fun." "I'd still like to come with you when you're looking for the spoons," said Simon. "You might meet the thieves." "They won't be able to see me if I do," said Tim, "but I may need you. Still, I can't promise anything." Tim met Aaron at school. Aaron lived in the yard too, and knew the hidden people. They went off to a corner of the playground, and Tim told Aaron what had happened at the weekend. "I haven't been home yet," said Aaron. "I stayed at my grandfather's house last night, but even my grandfather was saying there's been a lot of burglaries lately. Wonder if it's just chance, or if that's Jim and Kevin. You let me help, Tim?" "Yeah, of course," said Tim, "but I don't know what we're going to have to do yet. I don't think we can do much during the week. I wish it was Easter. We can't be out all night with the hidden people when we have to be at school the next day." "We'll have to do things at the weekend," said Aaron. "Perhaps Tobias and Sebastian will have found something out by then." It was Friday night before anything more happened. During the week, Sebastian was out most of the time, and Tim guessed that he must be with Tobias. Tim scarcely saw him. Sebastian usually managed to be home for supper, but he went out again as soon as he finished. Tim woke up once or twice to find Sebastian asleep on his bed, but the little cat was gone by the morning. Even Aunt May noticed Sebastian was unusually missing. "I can't think what's got into that cat," she said. "He must be courting." "I don't think he is," said Tim. "I shouldn't be surprised," said Aunt May. On Friday, Tim went to bed early. He'd been worrying about Mr. Berryman's spoons most of the week, and he hadn't been sleeping very well. But on Friday, he fell asleep as soon as he got into bed. He'd been asleep for some hours when the window suddenly fell open with a bang. Tim sat up. Tobias was standing on the foot of his bed. "Hello, Tim," said Tobias. "I found them, Jim and Kevin." "Oh, that's great, Tobias," said Tim. "Where are they?" "They're not far away," said Tobias. "They're in a house in Bargeman's Square on the other side of the canal, and Mr. Berryman's house isn't the only one they burgled. I saw them climbing out of a window in Baker's Lane tonight and followed them home. The house is full of stuff they've stolen." "Did you see the spoons?" asked Tim. "Yes. At least, I saw some spoons. They'd boxes of them." "Do you know which one are Mr. Berryman's?" "Yeah, I've seen them," said Tim. "I think I'd know." "Then you'd better come with me now and get them," said Tobias. "It shouldn't be too difficult. I'll make you invisible. Come on." "Where's Sebastian?" asked Tim as he scrambled out of bed. "Melinda wanted to see him," said Tobias. "He's taken a broomstick over to a cottage. He spotted Kevin. He was quite sure about him." Tim pulled on his clothes over his pyjamas. He put on his gloves and anorak. He picked up his torch and went to the window. A broomstick was riding in the air outside. Tobias jumped onto the windowsill and outside onto the broomstick. Tim pushed his torch into his pocket and climbed out onto the broomstick himself. He'd done that so many times that he no longer thought about the drop to the yard below. Tobias flew the broomstick up smoothly over the roofs of the houses and across the canal. He flew along Bridge Street till he came to Bargeman's Square. "That's it," he said. "That's where Jim and Kevin are." Bargeman's Square wasn't very big, There were terraced houses on either side of it, and a grimy statue of a seaman in the middle. All the houses had basement windows set in a well and level with the ground. 4 roads ran into the square. The house Tobias meant was at the end of a row on the far side. He flew the broomstick over to it. There was no attic window, but there was a skylight in the roof. "They keep the stuff in the basement," said Tobias. "I've been in, but this is the best way to get inside. There are bars over the basement window, and somebody may be sleeping in the bedrooms. Shall I come down on the roof?" "Yeah, all right," said Tim. Tobias brought the broomstick close to the skylight. "The window's only on a catch," said Tobias. "I can move the catch back for you, and the window will open." He twitched his tail. Tim heard a faint click. The skylight lifted up a little way off the roof. Tim bent down and raised it up. To his surprise, there was a ladder up to the skylight, fixed against the wall inside. He climbed in and stood on the ladder, holding the window up. "What are you going to do with the broomstick?" he asked. "Leave it in the gutter till we come back," said Tobias. "Wait a moment." He flew the broomstick down to the gutter and set it down carefully, and then he ran up the tiles to the window and jumped onto Tim's shoulder. "Shut the skylight carefully," he said. "We don't want to make a noise. I think they've gone to bed." Tim shut the skylight down softly and climbed down the ladder. It was very dark. He pulled out his torch and switched it on. He was standing in a little box room. Old trunks and suitcases stood on each side. The box room had a ceiling which sloped at one side. At the top of a ladder, opposite the skylight, Tim saw an opening in under the ridge of a roof. At the bottom of the ladder, just in front of him, there was a door into the house. Tim switched off his torch and opened the door. When his eyes were used to the dark again, he could just make out one door to his right and another to his left. Some railings guarded the stairwell near him. He went out onto the landing and closed the door behind him. He could hear someone snoring in the room to his left. He tiptoed to the top of the stairs. There was another door there. He crept past it and down the stairs. Tobias led the way. "Along the passage," whispered Tobias. "This way." He turned right at the foot of the stairs into a narrow passage which led to an outside door. Tim switched on his torch and followed him. He couldn't see a black cat properly in the dark. Tobias only went a few metres before he stopped in front of a door that led under the stairs. Tim opened it and saw a flight of steps leading down into a cellar. "This way," said Tobias. "Everything's down here." He ran down the steps and Tim followed. There was a pile of coal in front of him near the foot of the stairs. There was another door on the right. "It's all in there," said Tobias softly, looking at the door. Tim turned the handle. The door opened. He went in with Tobias and shut the door softly behind him. Tim lifted his torch and shone the beam first on one side of the room and then on the other. The room was like an Aladdin's cave. There was a red curtain across the window. There were shelves all around the walls and a table in the middle of the room. The light from a torch picked up the sparkle of silver. There were silver mugs and trays, silver teapots and jugs, candlesticks and vases. There were open boxes of silver spoons and other boxes with silver knives and forks in them. Tim drew in a deep breath. One shelf was packed with radios and cassette players and flat closed boxes. Tim guessed that the boxes held more spoons and cutlery, but when he opened one, he found that it was full of necklaces and rings which sparkled in the light. "They must have been stealing things for weeks," Tim said. "Months, I should think," said Tobias. "Can you see the spoons you want anywhere?" "They'll be in one of these boxes, I expect," said Tim. Yeah, this looks like it, yes." He was just putting out his hand to pick up one of the flat boxes when a big rat suddenly leapt out from behind a box on the shelf and scuttled down onto the floor. Tim was so startled that he jumped backwards. He tripped over some fire irons which were propped up against the table. The fire irons fell to the ground with a crash. Tim turned quickly. He knocked against an open box of cutlery and that too crashed to the ground. "Quick," said Tobias. "They'll have heard us. Have you got Mr. Berryman's spoons?" Tim picked up the flat box. He opened it and shone his torch on it. "This is it," he said. "I remember it. I'm sure this is the one." "Good," said Tobias. "Put it under your sweater. You're invisible now. If it's under your sweater, it'll be invisible too. There's someone coming." Tim pushed the box up under his sweater and moved to the far corner of the room. He stood there, scarcely daring to breathe. He listened. Tobias's ears were a good deal sharper than his, for at first he heard nothing, but then there were footsteps overhead. A door opened, and he heard footsteps coming down the flight of stairs to the basement. "The door's shut," said Kevin's voice outside. "Open it then," he heard a man say. "We'll soon see what's happening." The door was flung open. Someone switched on the light. A big man was standing in the doorway. Tim stared at his hand. He was holding a gun. The big man was wearing pyjamas. He had thick black hair. His face was rather pale, as though he wasn't out often in the sun, and he had a black beard. "There's no one here," he said, stepping in and looking round. Tim held his breath. The man was looking straight at him. "A box has fallen down," said Kevin, coming into the room behind him, "and the fire irons." A rat suddenly shot out from behind the box, streaked across the room and ran out of the door. "Ha ha ha ha!" The big man laughed, and Tim breathed again. "That's what it was," he said. "Just a rat. What a racket it made. I must get some traps in the morning. I'm surprised it didn't wake Jim up." "He's tired," said Kevin. "We'd only just got to bed. We did that house in Baker's Lane tonight." "Get anything?" asked the man. He glanced around the room. "I don't see anything new." "We just got some money," said Kevin. "How much?" asked the man. £5, said Kevin. £5? exclaimed the man. £5? You do a house and you only get £5? Wasn't there anything else you could take? She woke up. That old woman, Mrs. Kelsey. "So what happened?" asked the man. Suddenly he sounded very angry. "She came down and found us. Jim thumped her." "Well, what happened then? You better tell me, Kevin." He leered angrily at Kevin. Kevin took a step backwards. It wasn't me," he said. "It was Jim, and he didn't hit her very hard." "You don't have to when they're that age," said the man. "How old is she? 80? "Well, what happened?" "She fell over and we left," said Kevin sulkily. "You ran away, you mean," said the man. "You fools! You stupid fools! Don't you know you could kill an old woman like that? And then where would we be?" "Jim only pushed her over," said Kevin. "She was breathing all right." "Well, I hope she is," said the man. "You stupid fools. I've told you not to use violence. I won't have people using violence when they're working for me. You may be my nephews, but you're working for me just the same." "You've got a gun yourself," said Kevin. "So I've got a gun," growled the big man. "All right, I keep it in this house. In this house, Kevin. I don't take it out with me when I do a job. There's a lot of stuff in this house just now. I keep a gun here to protect it against any of our friends who might fancy it. But I don't take it out with me. Not me. I'm not a fool." "Did anyone see you and Jim in Baker's Lane?" I think they might have done," said Kevin. "There was an old man in the street when we got out of the window. He shouted at us, and then he went to the house. He was knocking on the door when we ran round the corner." "And you didn't tell me?" exclaimed the man. "You just came home and went to bed, and Jim went to sleep. God, you're even more stupid than I thought." "Well, at least that man will have got help. Called the police, I expect, so the old woman will be looked after. I hope she doesn't die, that's all." "People don't die when they fall over," said Kevin. "They do sometimes if they're over 80, said the big man. "Old bones break easily. I hope she's all right for your sake. I'll send both of you out of town tomorrow. You can stay at Piper's farm for a while till this is blown over. You'd better go to bed now, and I'll have something to say to Jim in the morning." The big man switched off the light. They went out, shutting the door behind them. Tim heard the key turn in the lock. Footsteps went back up the stairs. The door at the top of the steps closed. They heard footsteps overhead, and then the house was quiet again. "We're locked in," said Tim quietly, switching on his torch. "Don't let that worry you," said Tobias. I can manage a simple lot like that. Let's just give them time to get back to bed. Put the torch out. We don't want anyone outside to see a torch flashing in here." They waited silently in the darkness. Tim could feel his heart beating. It was all very well for Tobias to be so certain that he could get out. Tim wasn't at all sure. It seemed a long time to Tim before Tobias said, "I think they'll be asleep now. Come on, I'll turn that lock back." Tim couldn't see what Tobias did. Tobias was difficult to see in the dark, but he heard the lock click back. "Open the door," said Tobias. "We can go now." Tim groped his way across to the door and turned the handle. The door opened. Tim breathed a sigh of relief. He went through it to the darkness of the cellar. "Tobias," he whispered. "I'm here, Tim," said Tobias. "Shut the door." Tim closed the door very quietly. "You can switch that torch on now if you want," said Tobias. "I suppose you can't see in the dark. It must be very difficult being one of the ordinary folk." "It's easy when you have one of the hidden people with you," Tim said. Tobias stood for a moment facing the door, his long tail stretched out behind him. His ears went back. The lock on the door clicked shut. "That'll fool them," he said. "Come on, Tim, let's get away." He led the way up the stairs. Tim opened the door at the top, and they went out into the hall. "He keeps the key in the drawer of that little table," whispered Tobias. "I saw him get it out last time I was in the house. So, it's there if you want it. Switch your torch out now." Tim saw the little table. He switched his torch off and groped his way back to the stairs. When he got to the landing above, he stood still for a moment listening. He heard snores coming from the back room. Tobias laughed softly. "They're asleep again," he whispered. "Come on." Tim tiptoed along the landing and went into the box room. In the light that all filtered in through the skylight, he saw Tobias already standing on the top of the ladder. "You'd better open the skylight, Tim," said Tobias. "It bangs a bit if I do it." Tim climbed up the ladder. He undid the catch and pushed up the skylight. Tobias jumped out onto the roof and Tim climbed after him. "Wait here while I get the broomstick," said Tobias. "Ordinary folk are no good at climbing roofs." Tim hung onto the edge of the open skylight. Tobias went quickly down the roof to the gutter. Tim saw him twitch his tail. The broomstick lifted into the air. Tobias jumped onto one end and rode it back up to the skylight. Tim moved onto it carefully. He held onto the broomstick with one hand and shut the skylight with the other. It slipped and came down with a bang. Tobias flicked his tail and the broomstick shot up and over the roof. "I thought you could close it quietly," he said over his shoulder. "I couldn't have made a bigger bang for myself." "Not that it matters. They won't know what happened. You still got the spoon safely." Tim touched the hard box under his sweater. "Yes," he said. "Then there's nothing to worry about," said Tobias. "Yes, there is," said Tim. "Do you think we'll go over to Baker's Lane before we go home? I'd like to be sure somebody did help that old lady who lives there." "All right," said Tobias, "but we shouldn't be too long. It'll be getting light soon. You don't want someone to go up to your room and find you out. Not after what's been happening." He swung the broomstick back over Bargeman Square and across the roof of the houses on the far side. In a few minutes, Tim saw Baker's Lane below them. The street lights were on, and so were all the lights in one of the houses. An ambulance was standing outside the door, and there was a police car in the road. As they flew over, the front door opened, and two men carried a stretcher out to the ambulance. "There you are," said Tobias. "That man must have called the police. There's nothing more you can do." "All right," said Tim. "Let's get home." He was shivering a little. He wasn't sure whether it was because he was cold, or whether it was because he felt so troubled about the old lady. Tobias swept the broomstick round in a big circle and headed for the yard. They flew over the canal and through the gap in the houses. The broomstick stopped outside Tim's window. "Here we are, Tim," said Tobias. "You can take the spoons back to Mr. Berryman's yourself, can't you? You've got some of Melinda's magic drink with you." "Yeah, I've got it in my room," said Tim. "Yeah, I'll be all right. At least, I think I will." "Make sure you take the silver whistle with you," said Tobias. "The one Melinda gave you. Then you can call Sebastian if you get into trouble." Melinda had given Tim a silver whistle. He couldn't hear it himself when he blew it, but Sebastian could, even if he was a long way away. The whistle was in Tim's drawer. "I'll take it," Tim said. "Thanks, Tobias. I'll be all right now." He climbed into his bedroom. "Good night," said Tobias. He was gone before Tim could reply. Tim shut the window and lit the candles by his bed. He pulled the box of silver spoons from out under his sweater and opened it. Yes, he was sure these were the ones Mr. Berryman had shown him. He pushed the box into his top drawer behind his clothes, and then he undressed and got into bed. "I'll have to do something about it," he said to himself. "I can't let Jim and Kevin go on like this. I'll have to try and stop them. We all will. I'll tell Aaron in the morning." He suddenly felt very tired. There was nothing more he could do that night. It was nearly morning anyway. Tim shut his eyes and went to sleep. "Tim? Tim, are you awake? Tim!" Tim opened his eyes and sat up. The sunlight was streaming into his room. Aunt May was calling up the attic stairs. "I'm coming," he called back. "Be quick, I want you down here straight away," called Aunt May. Tim jumped out of bed. Aunt May didn't often speak like that. It must be something important. He put on his clothes as quickly as he could. He pulled a comb through his hair and ran downstairs. Aunt May was in the kitchen, down in the basement. There were 2 policemen with her. Tim could see that Aunt May was very upset. "Did you go out last night, Tim?" she asked as he came into the room. "Just for a bit," said Tim. "Where did you go, Tim?" asked one of the policemen. "Over to Bargeman Square," said Tim. "Did you go into Baker's Lane?" Tim shook his head. "No," he said. It was quite true. He hadn't gone into Baker's Lane. He'd flown over it on a broomstick. "Are you sure?" asked a policeman. "Yeah," said Tim. "What time was it when you were out?" "Oh, I don't know," said Tim. "I wasn't out very long. I was in most of the evening." "What did you do?" asked the policeman. "Nothing much." "Why did you go? You must have gone over there for some reason." Tim thought hard. He didn't want to tell any lies, but he couldn't tell them about Tobias and the silver spoons. "I was looking for burglars," he said at last. "Mr. Berryman's very upset about losing his things, and I wanted to help him get them back." Said the policeman. "You can leave that to us, Tim. You're sure you didn't take anything from Mr. Berryman's house yourself the other night?" "Of course I didn't," said Tim. He turned to Aunt May. "You know I wouldn't," he said. "Mr. Berryman's a friend of mine." "I know he is, Tim," said Aunt May. "But they say they found a muddy footprint inside Mr. Berryman's, and it was made by a boy's shoe, not a man's, and there's another one just like it at the house in Baker's Lane." "Well, it wasn't mine," said Tim. "Your foot's about the right size," said the policeman, "and it was your kind of shoe as well." "Lots of boys wear shoes like that, and girls too," said Aunt May. "So they do," said the policeman. "Well, Tim, here's something else. You said that young Simon was with you the night Mr. Berryman's house was burgled, didn't you?" "He was with me," said Tim. "He was with me all evening." "Mr. Berryman found Simon's glove just outside his back window next morning," said the policeman. "Simon didn't go into Mr. Berryman's house," said Tim. "Not when he was with me, and I'm sure he didn't go in afterwards." "Why are you so sure?" asked the policeman. "He wouldn't do it," said Tim. The policeman said again. He turned to Aunt May. "Could we go into Tim's room?" he asked. "Would you mind if we had a look through his things?" Tim drew in a deep breath. He couldn't help himself. He thought of the drawer with his clothes in it. Mr. Berryman's silver spoons were in that drawer. So was a silver whistle, and Melinda's bottle with a magic drink. The policeman looked at him quickly. "What's wrong with us looking in your room, Tim?" he asked. "Nothing," said Tim. "You look a bit pale," said the policeman. "Anyone would look pale with policemen in the house," said Aunt May. "Look, you don't mind, do you, Tim? We'll all go upstairs together. Come along." Aunt May led the way to Tim's attic bedroom. Tim followed her, and both policemen came up after them. Tim thought he had never been so unhappy in all his life. They would find the spoons, and then everyone would think he'd taken them. Mr. Berry wouldn't be friends with him any longer. He would think Tim was a thief, and how would Aunt May feel? There was nothing he could do about it. He stood at one side while the policeman went quickly over the room, looking at everything. "I'll just look in these drawers," one of them said, turning to Aunt May. "You can look anywhere you like," said Aunt May. "Tim has nothing to hide, have you, Tim?" Tim said nothing. He wished that Aunt May was right. The policeman opened the top drawer and pushed Tim's clothes to one side. Tim held his breath. The policeman felt in the back of the drawer. He felt all around among the clothes. He pulled out his hand and shut the drawer. He opened the lower drawers and looked in them too. "Nothing here," he said to the policeman. Tim stared at him. He could scarcely believe his ears. "I'll just take a quick look at the other attic," said the policeman. He went across the landing. "We'll wait downstairs for you," said Aunt May. "Come along, Tim." They went downstairs to the kitchen in silence. One policeman went with them. The second one soon joined them, and Tim saw him look at the first policeman and shake his head. "Well, that's all right so far," said the first policeman. "You keep it that way, Tim. Stay at home at night. Don't go out looking for burglars. Leave that to the police." "Good morning, Miss McNair, and thank you very much." "I'll see you out," said Aunt May. She went upstairs with the two men to the front door. Tim sat down on a chair. His knees were shaking so much that he could scarcely stand. Aunt May came bustling down the stairs again. "Well, that's all over," she said. "You do look a bit white, Tim. You've no need to be afraid of policemen. They're people who help you, really, unless you've done anything wrong. They had me worried for a bit. I didn't like the way they looked at you, but I knew you wouldn't do anything like that. I know you, Tim." She came over to him and gave him a hug. Tim was surprised. Aunt May didn't often hug him. In fact, she'd been very good about everything. He had felt she was defending him, and she was on his side. "I'm glad they've gone," he said. "Have your breakfast and you'll feel better," said Aunt May. "You do look white. What did you want to go out at night for, looking for burglars? You'll never find them, and I'd rather you didn't. I don't want you to get into trouble, and I don't want you to get hurt." "I'll be all right," said Tim. "Well, you stay at home and get your rest," said Aunt May. "I can't go out myself if I think you're wandering around, and I have to go to work at the shop. We need the money." "Eat your breakfast. Eat that, and you'll feel better." Tim ate his breakfast. It did make him feel rather better, but he thought he would feel better still when he'd looked in his drawers. He was so thankful the spoons hadn't been found. He choked over his tea at the thought of what might have happened. Tim got out of the kitchen as soon as he could and raced upstairs 2 at a time. He opened the door of his room, ran over to the chest of drawers and pulled open the top drawer. He pushed his clothes to one side. The policeman was right. There was nothing but his clothes in the drawer. The spoons, the whistle and Melinda's bottle have all gone. "Is this what you're looking for?" said a voice behind him. Tim span around. A boy of his own age was standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a strange-looking coat with knee breeches. He had black shoes with black buckles on his feet. He was holding a box of spoons and the whistle and the bottle in his hand. "Jared!" cried Tim. "Jared, however did you get in here?" He had last seen Jared by the fire on Hollow Hill. Jared laughed. "Sebastian bought me," he said. "He's outside putting the broomstick away. We were talking to Jessica when we heard the police car drive into the yard. We saw it stop outside your house, and Jessica thought you might need some help, so Sebastian flew me over." "I'm so glad," cried Tim. "I thought I'd had it that time." He laughed shakily. He hadn't quite got over the anxiety of the last hour. "Where were you when the police were up here?" he said. "I was in the back attic, but they couldn't see me, of course," said Jared, "and I hid your things under my coat so they couldn't see them either. Look, here's Sebastian." Sebastian came running up the stairs. He dashed in and took a flying leap into Tim's arms. He was purring loudly. "Sebastian's very pleased with himself," said Jared. "And I am pleased too," said Tim, "and with you. I can't tell you how thankful I am that you were here." "Melinda told me what was happening," said Jared, "and I thought I might come and see if I could help. But it was Jessica who guessed the police might search your room. Shall I put the spoons back in Mr. Berryman's house for you? It's the house in the corner, isn't it?" "Could you please?" said Tim. "I'll show you which house it is." They went to the window. Tim pointed to Mr. Berryman's house. "Look, it's that one over there." "I'll take 'em over straight away," said Jared. He put the box with the spoons into an inside pocket in his coat. "You'd better take the other things." Tim took the whistle and Melinda's bottle and put them back in his drawer. "Someone ought to keep a watch on the house in Bargeman Square," he said. "Do you know about it?" Jared nodded. "Tobias told me about it," he said. "He came back just before I left. Would you like me to go along there after I've taken the spoons back?" "Could you go and take a look?" asked Tim. "I don't expect they'll have moved anything during the day, but you never know." "We'll need to know where they hide their loot, but come back this afternoon. We'll have a meeting with the others. We've got to stop Jim and Kevin somehow. They've really hurt someone this time." "I'll get Aaron. Jessica and Simon ought to be here too." "All right," said Jared. "I'll go now. I'll walk. Then Sebastian can stay with you and get some sleep. He's a bit tired." "I'll come down with you," said Tim. "I'll go across and see Aaron's right away." They went down into the yard together. Tim stopped under the tree. He watched Jared go across to Mr. Berryman's house and round to the back garden. He was just going across to Aaron's when Aaron opened the front door and came running down the steps to join him. "Hello, Tim," said Aaron. "Is everything all right? I saw the police car from my window. What's happened?" "Did you see Jared?" asked Tim. Aaron shook his head. "I haven't got the magic key on me this morning," he said. "I'll put it on right away. What happened?" "The police came because they'd found a boy's footprint in Mr. Berryman's, and Jim and Kevin burgled another house last night and hurt an old lady. There was a boy's footprint in that house too. Mr. Berryman told the police about finding Simon's glove in the garden, so they came to see me." "How rotten," said Aaron. "Was it all right?" "Yes," said Tim, "but it was nearly all wrong." "The police went over to Simon's house after they left you," said Aaron. "I was watching them, but there was no one in, so they left." The door of Simon's house opened, and Simon and Jessica came running down the steps across the yard to them. "What happened?" cried Simon. "What are the police doing?" Tim told them. "It was a good thing you sent Jared across to my room, Jess," he said. "Last night, Tobias took me along to the place where Jim and Kevin are living. We found Mr. Berryman's spoons and I brought them back with me. They're in my drawer. Jared got there just before the police and hid them. He's taken them over to Mr. Berryman's now." "The policeman came over to us too," said Simon. "But it was after they'd left you, after Jared had gone. But Uncle Joe and Aunt Lizzie were out, so the front door was locked. And you bet we didn't open it." "Look here," said Tim. "We've got to have a proper meeting. We've got to stop Jim and Kevin. They're not only stealing things, they've knocked an old lady down. They're working with their uncle. I'll tell you about it, but it'll take a bit of time. We've got to stop them somehow." "Come over to my house this afternoon," said Aaron. "Come and have some tea. Dad's away and Mother's going out with Sita. She won't mind a bit. Then we can work it all out." "Could we?" said Tim. "That would be really helpful." "Yes, of course," said Aaron. "I'll come right after dinner," said Tim. "You too, Jess and Simon?" "You bet," said Simon. "Come as soon as you can," said Aaron, "and then we'll have the whole afternoon." They all met at Aaron's house at 2:30. Aaron took them up to his bedroom. Like Tim, Aaron slept in the attic overlooking the yard. The room had been fitted up for him like a study. He had a table with a drawer in it for a desk. There were shelves for his books all along one wall. There was a carpet on the floor. He had an electric fire too, so the room was warm. His bed was covered with a rug, so he could use it as a sofa. There was an armchair, another small table, and a straight chair for the desk. There was a chest of drawers and a cupboard too. The room looked bright and comfortable. Aaron sat in a straight chair. He made Tim sit in the armchair because it was Tim's meeting. Jessica and Simon sat on the sofa bed. "Now then," said Aaron, "tell us about it, Tim. What's happened since we last saw you?" Tim told him about his adventures with Tobias. He told them what Jim and Kevin had been doing and what their uncle had said. He told them about the gun. He told them how the police had come to see him and the questions they asked. "You can see why we've got to stop Jim and Kevin," he said. "The police think we've been doing some of the burglaries. But it's not just that. Jim must have hit that old lady really hard. They took her to hospital in an ambulance. We flew over Baker's Lane and I saw them carry her out. And that won't be the last time Jim hit someone. You know what he's like, Aaron. We've got to stop him." "You don't have to hit old people very hard to hurt them," said Aaron. "They can break bones just falling over, and if they break their bones, They sometimes die. Yeah, that's what Kevin's uncle said Tim. There's only one way to stop Jim and Kevin, said Aaron. We'll have to tell the police what we know. We can't do that, said Tim. They'd want to know how we knew, and we can't tell them about the hidden people. They wouldn't believe us if we did. They'd think we'd been helping Jim and Kevin do the burglaries ourselves. They'd think we decided to shop them. Shop them? Questioned Simon. Tell the police what we knew, said Tim. The police would think we were doing it to save ourselves. And then, always ever after, they'd think we were really burglars too, said Jessica. That's just it, said Tim. We've got to think of some way of showing the police who the real burglars are without them knowing we're helping them. But how? Asked Aaron. I don't see how we can do that. But of course we can, cried Jessica. The hidden people will help us. What we've got to do is see if the police find a lot of clues leading them to the real burglars. I'm sure we can do it. Jessica's right, said Tim. I've been thinking about it. We've got to plant lots of clues. What sort of clues? Asked Aaron. The loot, cried Simon cheerfully. The police have got to find the loot. We've got to get them to search Jim's house the way they did Tim's room, said Jessica. Could we ring them up and tell them to go and look there? We needn't tell them who was ringing. We can't do that, said Tim. They'd guess it was us, and either they wouldn't take any notice, or else they'd find the things, and then come and question us. That won't do. We've got to think of something else. I'll tell you what, said Jessica. The police are bound to be keeping a lookout at night just now with all the burglars around here. Why don't we wait till they're just going by Jim's house and then put a silver candlestick or something for them to see on the pavement? Jared could do it for us. They won't be able to see him. I could do it too, said Tim. I've got Melinda's mixture. I could make myself invisible for an hour or two any time. You said I could be invisible sometime too, said Simon. We all could, said Tim. But we'll have to be careful. People can hear us, you know, even when they can't see us. It's more dangerous to go round in a crowd, and don't forget that gun. There's something else. Jim and Kevin aren't in that house now. They're going to leave in the morning. Do you know where they are? Asked Aaron. Their uncle said they'd better go to Piper's farm, said Tim. Isn't that the wood near Belinda's house called Piper's Wood? Good for you, Jess, said Simon. I bet Piper's farm is near there. I expect you're right, said Tim. Perhaps Jared will know. You could take lots of things from the house in Bargement Square, said Jessica. We could use one or two to get the police to search there, then we could take the others to Piper's farm and hide them there. Sebastian would fly us there one night. That would do it, said Aaron. They went on discussing their plans until tea time. Aaron and Jessica went downstairs to collect a couple of trays with the tea things. Aaron's mother had put out 2 plates of little cakes and chocolate biscuits for them to eat. Aaron made some toast and took it up. Tim wandered across a window and looked down into the yard. Jared was standing by the old tree. Have you got your magic coin on, Simon? Asked Tim. You bet, said Simon. Jared's by the tree. Would you go and fetch him? Oh, good, said Simon, and he ran off down the stairs. By the time Aaron's mother came home, they'd eaten their tea and worked out their plans. Nothing was to happen till the next weekend. Everyone agreed that while they had to be at school all day, they must get some sleep at night unless there was an emergency. But Sebastian was to be asked to keep an eye on Bargement Square during the week. Jared knew Piper's farm. He would ask Tobias to watch what was happening there. In the meantime, Jared would watch the police cars at night to see if he could find out which one was likely to drive through Bargement Square. When he wasn't on watch, Jared would stay with Tim. Tim and Jared would capture some of the loot next Friday if they could. Then they'll try to put the rest of their plan into action as soon as possible. Tim had said goodbye to the others and was just going into his own gate when Mr. Berryman called him. Tim? Wait a moment, Tim, called Mr. Berryman. Tim turned round. Mr. Berryman was just coming out of his house. Tim went over to him. Hello, Mr. Berryman, he said. Tim, said Mr. Berryman, Tim, the most extraordinary thing has happened. What is it? Asked Tim. You remember I told you that the thieves had taken my mother's silver spoons? Asked Mr. Berryman. Tim nodded. Well, someone has brought them back, said Mr. Berryman. I went into the dining room just now, and they were there, on the table. They weren't there at dinner time. Well, I'm so glad you got them back, said Tim. So am I, said Mr. Berryman, but I wish I knew how they got back. Tim said nothing. I suppose you don't know anything about it, asked Mr. Berryman. I've been over with Aaron all afternoon, said Tim. Jessica and Simon were there too. Well, it's a strange thing, said Mr. Berryman. I didn't tell anyone about those spoons except you and Simon and the police. Of course, the police may have told other people. I expect they have. But what kind of burglar would take the spoons and then bring them back? You knew that they meant a lot to me, but the burglars didn't. And they wouldn't have cared if they had known, would they? I didn't take your spoons, Mr. Berryman, said Tim. Mr. Berryman sighed. Well, Tim, I'm glad to have them back, he said. I hope everyone gets their things back too. I expect other people care as much about some of their things as I do about my mother's spoons. All right, Tim. I won't ask any more questions, but I hope you're all right, boy. I do hope you're all right. He turned and went back into his house. Tim went slowly indoors and up to his room. We've got to fix it up next weekend, he said to himself. We've just got to. Mr. Berryman will always think we did it if they don't find Jim and Kevin. Jared had gone back to Bargeman Square. Tim wondered whether they should wait for the weekend or put their plan into action now. But when he thought about it, he decided it was better to wait. They had to find out when the police patrolled Bargeman Square before they could do anything else at all.